I never expected Evelyn Porter to leave me anything in her will. We hadn't been particularly close, just neighbors who exchanged pleasantries over adjoining fences and collected each other's mail during vacations. When her lawyer called to inform me I'd been named in her will, I was genuinely surprised. "She left you a specific item," Mr. Thornton explained, "along with a letter. Could you come by my office to collect them?" At 69, I had been retired from nursing for 7 years and was always looking for small excursions to break the pleasant monotony of my days. A trip to a lawyer's office wasn't exactly exciting, but it offered a change from my usual routine of gardening, reading, and FaceTiming with my grandchildren in California. The item turned out to be a wooden music box, beautifully crafted with inlaid mother-of-pearl and delicate carvings of roses around its edges. It was lovely, but didn't look particularly valuable, certainly not something that required a lawyer's involvement to transfer ownership. "She was quite specific that this go directly to you," Mr. Thornton said, handing me the box along with a sealed envelope. The letter explains her wishes. I thanked him and took my unexpected inheritance home, setting it on my kitchen table while I made a cup of tea. The music box was approximately the size of a hardcover book, its wood darkened with age but still gleaming from careful polishing. When I opened the lid, a gentle melody played, Beethoven's Furlies, rendered in delicate tinkling notes. Inside, lined with faded blue velvet, was a small compartment that appeared empty at first glance. But as I examined it more carefully, I noticed the velvet bottom seemed to sit slightly higher than it should. Curious, I pressed gently around the edges until I found a spot that gave way. The false bottom lifted to reveal a hidden compartment beneath. My heart quickened at this discovery. What had Evelyn been hiding? I half expected to find jewelry or money, but instead, the secret space contained only 3 items. A black and white photograph of a young woman with distinctive 1940s-style hair and clothing, a folded paper that proved to be a birth certificate, and a small key on a tarnished silver chain. Puzzled, I set these items aside and turned my attention to Evelyn's letter, hoping it would provide some explanation. "Dear Catherine," it began in Evelyn's precise handwriting. "If you're reading this, I finally gathered the courage to tell the truth, albeit posthumously. The music box that accompanies this letter belonged to my mother, Elena Visconti. The woman in the photograph is also Elena, taken in 1943 when she was 20 years old. The birth certificate is mine. Though, as you'll see, the name on it is not Porter, but Visconti. And the key opens a safe deposit box at First National Bank, where I've left additional items I'd like you to have. Why am I telling you this? Because we share more than a property line, Catherine. We share blood. Elena Visconti was your mother's older sister. I discovered this connection 5 years ago when you mentioned your mother's maiden name during a conversation about Italian cooking. I had known of my mother's sister, my Aunt Isabella, but had been told she died during the war. When you mentioned that your mother had emigrated from Italy in 1946, that she had grown up near Milan, I began to suspect. A bit of research confirmed it. You and I are first cousins. I didn't tell you then, because the story of why our mothers were estranged is complicated and painful. I've left the full explanation in the safe deposit box, along with family photographs and documents that rightfully belong to you as much as to me. With no children of my own, you are my closest living relatives, though you never knew it during my lifetime. I'm sorry for my cowardice in not telling you while I was alive. Some truths are harder to speak than others. Your cousin, Evelyn. I set the letter down with trembling hands, stunned by this revelation. Evelyn Porter, my quiet, private neighbor of 15 years, was my cousin? My mother, Isabella, who had died 10 years earlier, had a sister she'd never once mentioned? I picked up the birth certificate, confirming what Evelyn had written. Evelyn Marie Visconti, born April 12, 1944, in Milan, Italy. Mother, Elena Sofia Visconti. Father, listed as unknown. The photograph showed a beautiful young woman with dark hair and eyes, high cheekbones, and a determined set to her jaw. I could see echoes of my mother in her features, though this woman, Elena, had a more defiant expression than my reserved, proper mother had ever displayed in family photographs. I had grown up as an only child, raised by a mother who spoke little of her life in Italy before emigrating to America. There was the war, and then there was America. She would say whenever I pressed for details, nothing in between worth remembering. My father had respected her silence, and eventually so had I, assuming her reticence stemmed from wartime trauma too painful to revisit. But now, this music box and letter suggested there was much more to the story. Entire branches of family history deliberately pruned from the narrative I had been told. The following morning, I visited First National Bank, the small key clutched tightly in my hand. A bank officer escorted me to the safe deposit vault, verified Evelyn's documentation naming me as authorized to access her box, and left me alone in a private viewing room with the contents. Inside was a manila envelope thick with documents and photographs, a small jewelry box, and another sealed letter with my name on it. I started with the photographs, spreading them across the table in a timeline of hidden history. Elena and Isabella as children, dressed in identical dresses, dark hair in neat braids. The sisters as teenagers, arms linked, standing in front of what appeared to be a small village church. Elena in a nurse's aide uniform, looking serious but determined. Isabella in a wedding dress, next to a man I recognized as my father, much younger than I had ever seen him in photographs. And most surprising, a photo of Elena holding an infant with my mother standing beside her. Both women looking tense and unhappy despite the presumably joyous occasion. The documents included letters between the sisters, most in Italian, which I could read only haltingly despite my mother's half-hearted attempts to teach me the language as a child. From what I could decipher, they revealed a relationship that had deteriorated over time, with references to his betrayal and your unforgivable choice. I turned to Evelyn's second letter, hoping for clarity. Dear Catherine, the photographs and letters can only tell part of the story, and even I don't know all of it. What I do know came partly from my mother in her final years, partly from documents I discovered after her death, and partly from my own research. My mother Elena and your mother Isabella were inseparable as girls growing up in a small village outside Milan. When war came to Italy, they both worked as volunteer nurses' aides in a local hospital. It was there that Elena met an American soldier named James Porter, who was recovering from injuries. They fell in love. And when he was sent back to the front, he promised to return for her. In 1943, Elena discovered she was pregnant with me. James was missing in action by then, and the village was harshly judgmental of a woman expecting a child out of wedlock. Your mother, Isabella, was engaged to an older, well-respected local man. According to my mother, this man, your father, had once courted Elena before turning his attentions to the more conventional Isabella. When Elena's pregnancy became impossible to hide, she turned to Isabella and her fiancé for help. The details become murky here, but the result was catastrophic. Instead of supporting her sister, Isabella reportedly told her fiancé that Elena had tried to seduce him, attempting to steal him as she claimed Elena had once tried to steal James Porter's affections. The village turned against Elena. She was cast out, forced to leave in disgrace. She made her way to Milan, where she gave birth to me and struggled to survive in the war-torn city. Meanwhile, Isabella married, and from what my mother could determine, told everyone her sister had died. After the war, James Porter, who had been a prisoner of war, not killed as reported, found Alana in Milan. Despite my questionable parentage, Alana was never completely certain I was his biological child. He married her and brought us to America. They never had other children. Your mother emigrated to America with your father around the same time, settling on the opposite coast. As far as I know, the sisters never spoke again. Alana, my mother, died believing her sister had betrayed her in the worst possible way. I discovered your connection to Isabella when you moved next door 15 years ago. Your last name didn't immediately trigger recognition, Sullivan being common enough. But when you mentioned your mother's Italian heritage, I began to wonder. A photograph you once showed me of your mother as a young woman confirmed my suspicion, as did the details you occasionally shared about her early life. I didn't approach you with this information while alive for many reasons. Uncertainty about how much your mother had told you, fear of reopening old wounds, and honestly, cowardice about confronting such painful family history. But I've always felt we were meant to find each other. To perhaps heal some of the breach between our mothers, even if they never managed it in their lifetimes. The jewelry box contains my mother's cameo brooch and wedding ring. James Porter wasn't my biological father, but he was the only father I knew, and he loved me as his own. I have no children to pass these items to. As my only living blood relative, I'd like you to have them, along with the music box that traveled with my mother from Italy to America. What you do with this information is, of course, entirely up to you. If you prefer to remember your mother as you knew her, without the complication of this history, I would understand. But if you're reading this, I must have found the courage to at least offer you the truth as I know it. Your cousin Evelyn. I sat back, the letter trembling in my hands, overwhelmed by revelations that rewrote my family history. The mother I had known, proper, reserved, devoutly Catholic Isabella Sullivan, had betrayed her own sister in the most fundamental way, allowing her to be cast out, pregnant and alone in wartime Italy. Had told everyone, including her own daughter, that her sister was dead, had maintained that fiction for over 60 years. But there was another perspective to consider, my mother's. I had only Evelyn's account, which was itself secondhand, coming from Elena during what must have been a bitter and difficult time. What had really happened between the sisters? Had my mother truly betrayed Elena, or was there more to the story? I would never know. Both sisters were gone now, taking their complete truth with them. All that remained were fragments, photographs, letters, conflicting narratives, and the tangible items I now held. A music box that had traveled from war-torn Italy to suburban America. A cameo brooch worn by an aunt I never knew I had, and the wedding ring of a man who had chosen to love a child who might not have been his own. And of course, there was the newfound knowledge that Evelyn Porter, my quiet neighbor who had collected my mail and shared cuttings from her garden, had been my first cousin, watching me for 15 years, weighing whether to reveal our connection. Had I known her at all? The Evelyn I thought I knew was a retired librarian, a widow who kept to herself but was unfailingly polite. She had never mentioned Italy or displayed any particular connection to her heritage. She had never hinted at the complex history she carried within her. We had lived side by side, separated by a low fence and decades of silence. Over the next few weeks, I found myself revisiting memories of interactions with Evelyn, searching for clues I might have missed. Had there been moments when she almost told me, when she studied me particularly closely, when she seemed to be weighing her words with unusual care? I remembered her interest when I mentioned my plans to visit Italy 5 years earlier. "Will you go to the Milan region?" she had asked. "There's a lovely little village called Monteverde about 30 miles outside the city." I had thanked her for the suggestion, but hadn't included it in my itinerary. Had she been hoping I would visit our mother's birthplace, make some connection on my own? The music box now sat on my mantelpiece, its melody occasionally filling my living room when I opened it to examine the photograph of Elena. I wore her cameo brooch to church on Sundays, a quiet acknowledgement of this newly discovered branch of my family tree. But the most profound change wasn't in these tangible connections to the past. It was in my understanding of my mother, a woman I had respected and loved, but never fully known. The revelation of her estrangement from Elena added complexity to my memory of her, not all of it welcome. Had she lived with guilt about her sister, with regret, or had she justified her actions so completely that Elena truly was dead to her? I sifted through my memories of my mother, searching for any hint, any clue that might suggest remorse or even acknowledgement of what she had done. I remembered her reluctance to talk about Italy, her firmness when redirecting conversations away from her early life. I recalled her absolute refusal to consider a family trip to her homeland, despite my father's willingness to finance it. "There's nothing there for us now," she had said with a finality that brooked no argument. Most unsettling was the memory of a moment when I was perhaps 12. Looking through an old photo album and finding a picture that had been partially torn, showing my mother as a teenager, standing next to someone whose face had been removed from the image. "Who was that?" I had asked. "No one important," she had replied, taking the album from my hands and closing it firmly. "Just someone I used to know." Had that been Elena? Had my mother kept a photograph of her sister, even as she excised her from family narratives and memories? 3 months after receiving Evelyn's bequest, I made a decision. I booked a flight to Italy and a room in a small hotel in Monteverde, the village where my mother and her sister had grown up. I wasn't sure what I hoped to find there. The sister's childhood home, perhaps, or elderly villagers who might remember the Visconti family. Mostly, I think, I needed to see the place where this story had begun, to make some tangible connection to this history I had never known was mine. Before leaving, I visited Evelyn's grave, bringing a small arrangement of roses from my garden, cuttings originally shared by her years earlier. "I wish you had told me," I said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish talking to a headstone. "We lost so much time, Evelyn." But perhaps she had been right to wait, to let me learn this history after my mother was gone, when it could no longer damage our relationship. Perhaps her posthumous revelation was its own kind of kindness. The day before my departure for Italy, I was sorting through my mother's keepsakes, a box of items I had kept after her death but rarely examined. Among her rosary beads, faded holy cards, and the small gold cross she had worn daily, I found something unexpected, a tiny key on a ribbon, similar to the one that had opened the music box's secret compartment. With trembling fingers, I took the music box from the mantelpiece and examined it more carefully. There appeared to be only one keyhole, which worked with the key Evelyn had left, but as I turned the box in my hands, I noticed a nearly invisible seam along one side panel. When pressed, it revealed another, even smaller compartment, and inside, a folded piece of paper that had been hidden there for decades. It was a letter, written in Italian, dated 1972, the year after my father died. With the help of an online translation tool, I deciphered its contents. "My dear sister, I have written this letter 100 times in my mind over the years, but never found the courage to send it. Perhaps I never will. Perhaps these words will remain hidden in our mother's music box, which I took from our home when I fled Italy, the only item of hers I managed to keep. You believe I betrayed you. You are right, but not in the way you think. Alberto did try to force himself on you that night, as you claimed. I believed you. But when I confronted him, he threatened to abandon me if I stood by you. He said no one would believe your accusations against a respected man like him, especially coming from an unmarried woman already carrying another man's child. I was a coward, Elena. Afraid of being alone, of the village's judgment, of the uncertain future that war had created for all of us. I chose security over sisterhood. I chose wrong. When you left, I told myself you would be better off away from the village's cruelty. I told myself you would make a new life, find happiness elsewhere. I convinced myself it was for the best. I have lived with that lie and that choice every day since. When I heard you had made it to America, that you had found James again and married him, I felt a weight lift. When Alberto's job brought us to America too, I secretly hoped we might somehow find each other. But by then, the gulf between us seemed too wide to cross. What could I possibly say to make amends for such a betrayal? I named my daughter Catherine Elena, though I never told her about you. Another cowardice. If you are reading this, then somehow this music box has found its way back to you. Know that not a day has passed that I haven't thought of you, haven't regretted my failure when you needed me most. The sister I see in my memories is not the Elena who left our village in disgrace, but the Elena of our childhood, brave, clever, full of life and light. That is the Elena I have carried in my heart, the sister I lost not to war, but to my own weakness. With love and deepest regret, Isabella. I sat frozen, the letter in my hands, tears blurring my vision. A letter my mother had written but never sent. A confession hidden inside a music box she believed lost to her forever. A plea for understanding, perhaps even forgiveness, that had never reached its intended recipient. The story Evelyn had told me was true in its broad outlines, but crucially incomplete. My mother had indeed failed her sister, but had carried that guilt and regret throughout her life. The reserve I had always attributed to her nature might have been, at least in part, the weight of that unresolved pain. And the music box, how had it come to be in Evelyn's possession when my mother's letter suggested she had taken it from Italy? Had Elena somehow reclaimed it? Or had Isabella sent it to her sister years later, the unsent letter still hidden inside, the music box itself meant to be the message she couldn't put into words? I would never know the complete story. The principal players were all gone now. Elena, Isabella, Evelyn, James Porter, Alberto Sullivan. I was left with fragments, contradictions, and the painful knowledge that a simple conversation between sisters might have healed wounds that instead festered across continents and decades. Yet there was something else too, a sense of connection I had never expected to find at this stage of my life. I had grown up an only child, had raised an only child, had always envied those with large extended families. Now I discovered that all along, I had been part of a bigger family story than I knew, one marked by tragedy and division, yes, but also by love, regret, and the enduring bonds that even betrayal couldn't fully sever. I carefully folded my mother's letter and placed it back in the music box's secret compartment, alongside Elena's photograph. Then I wound the mechanism and listened as Fur Elise played its delicate melody in my quiet living room, the same notes that had once filled a small Italian village where two sisters grew up believing they would always have each other, before war and fear and human frailty pulled them apart. Tomorrow I would board a plane for Italy, carrying with me the complicated legacy of two sisters and the music box that had finally brought their story into the light. I didn't expect to find answers in Monteverde, but perhaps I would find something just as valuable, a sense of place, of roots, of belonging to a history larger than the one I had always known. And when I returned, I would visit Evelyn's grave again, to thank her properly for the most unexpected inheritance of all, the truth, with all its pain and healing power, that she had finally found the courage to share.